Hey everybody, so this week we are talking about convolutional neural networks. Those were winning the poll the last time I checked, although I admit I didn't check yesterday. But they're what I've prepared now, so that's what we've got. I think they're a pretty good first choice because a lot of the image projects are going to end up needing these. Also, while I am at it, I apologize if you can hear a little bit of faint singing in the background. Excuse me. My neighbors are having some kind of hoedown, so you might hear folk guitar a little bit. Alright, so the problem that they're trying to solve, to paraphrase from a thing I believe I said in class, I may have been getting from a paper, fully connected layers are very prone to overfitting. Why? Because you need to learn to associate every possible location, size, orientation, and variation of a feature to an individual unit. Okay? So I'm going to attempt to sketch on the screen why that would be the case. This is sort of a crude imitation of a thing I drew in class. So imagine that we have an input image. Oops. And that you want, like Fashion MNIST, to learn to recognize an article of clothing in here, okay? So abstractly, we get a bunch of weights that connect this image to a bunch of output units, right? What we likely are going to have happen is some set of weights will be, each one of these output units will be trained to recognize a particular thing, right? We might want this output unit to learn to recognize a shirt, for example, and then this one, if we're talking about Fashion MNIST, to be a shoe, right? The problem is, what could these weights actually look like, right? If we want to recognize a shirt here, and I said in class on Thursday, I am not an art major. If you want to recognize a shirt here, we might have weights in this region, right? So remember, each pixel, right, has a weight that connects it to this unit. Every pixel has a weight that maps from that pixel to this unit, okay? We want the pixels in this region to be large, right? To carry this information forward, and everywhere else in the image plane, we might want them to be 0. Okay? So to make this unit match this shirt, these pixels have to be high, everywhere else it's got to be 0. But, well, maybe I shouldn't have erased that. What if the shirt moves, right? If it's close enough, it's an object. If the shirt is down here, then we will need to have weights down here high so that it can detect a shirt down there. Well, what if the thing here is not a shirt, right? If it's a shoe, then, oh, come on now, yellow. Then those high weights will sabotage us, right? Because now this thing will just be detecting any object here. So what we actually need is another unit. Okay? We need one unit with weights that specifically connect this shirt shape to this unit, and then we need another shirt unit to detect shirts right here, right? And then we potentially need, by the same reasoning, a bunch of shoe units to detect all the different places that a shoe could be and all the different orientations that it could have, right? So a shoe with one orientation can be detected by one unit, but a shoe, even in the same location, that might just be turned differently, right? A shoe facing a different way, maybe with a slightly different feature, represents a completely different input pattern, and we would need to have another unit to associate with it, right? Clearly, right? Whoops. this is unsustainable, right? And this is why handwritten MNIST and fashion MNIST center and scale the image, right? They put the thing you're trying to recognize right in the middle, and then they scale it so they're all the same size, is so the network does not have to learn a zillion different neurons to associate with the same thing at different locations, right? But you can only kind of really solve this problem so much, right? Because even when you're trying to center and normalize, if the things you want to recognize are very different shapes, you still might have to learn many different weights and use many different neurons to recognize the same thing in a bunch of slightly different configurations. This is also why, so I'm going to call this fully connected. This is also why a large, fully connected layer will almost always overfit, because you cannot train it on every single possible version of a t-shirt that you want it to recognize as a t-shirt, right? So in the test set, it's going to have t-shirts that it's never seen before, possibly, if you didn't normalize, in locations it's never seen before, and it will have no neuron associated with that, right? And that's how the test performance can get very, very good, while the unseen performance can be very, very poor with a fully connected layer, okay? So there are a couple of ways that we can fix that, right? So the problem here, again, is that if we move or scale or in any way change an object, we potentially need a whole new neuron with a whole new sort of plane of weights to recognize that new variant of the object, and that's no good. Well, the brain, like the human brain, the animal brain, does not seem to have this problem, okay? If I'm holding a pen, and you can't see me unless you've hacked my webcam, in which case I'm sorry. So the pen that I'm holding in front of me, right, which makes this a bad demonstration, I can move that around in my visual field, and my brain doesn't like freak out, right? I don't lose object permanence and suddenly not understand the pen, right? And you have the same kind of problem where the pen is, the light from the pen is hitting different parts of my retina and going through a totally different set of nerves and landing in a slightly different set of my brain. And yet my brain can assemble this and keep track of that pen. Well, we actually do have some understanding of how the early visual cortex is set up, right? And so one of the ideas behind CNNs is let's borrow from this biological inspiration. This is the paper that I saw cited a whole bunch. I have not checked it out. Oh yeah, and then this. So I have added citations. Whoops. This is a paper I saw cited a whole bunch for like this little bit of neuroscience. This is what I kind of picked as the first big paper for convolutional neural networks. I believe that is the one that introduced Linet 5, which is a big deal. You'll see a bunch. This was a big enough neural network that it had its own page on Wikipedia. So if you hear me talk about the Linet paper, this is the one I'm referring to. Anyway, so if we mimic, so what if we look at the way the early visual cortex is set up and mimic that? Well, in the early visual cortex, you have a bunch of neurons that are responsible for looking for a specific feature, right? Like a line, right? Like a line of darkness dividing two regions of light, right? And they look for this very small feature in a specific patch of your receptive field, right? A specific set of like rod and cone cells, right? So neurons in your brain, the early ones, aren't looking at the entire like image. They're each responsible for a little bitty patch. And then there are a bunch of repeated neurons that look for similar patterns in adjacent patches, okay? So we refer to the region of your vision that a neuron is responsible for as its receptive field, all right? Other later neurons are responsible for combining that information into higher order features, right? So early neurons are looking for edges, light, shadows, Later neurons are learning to assemble edges and light and shadow to identify a pin, right? And this structure is repeated, so the neurons are going to be shaped fairly similarly, right? Different neurons will have fairly similar behavior in different little patches, right? So the same kind of thing is being handled no matter where the pen goes in my in my visual field. So, like many things neural network, there is a second completely distinct intuition for what's going on, and that is feature extraction. In the old days, human experts used to design feature extractors by hand, right? Where a feature extractor was a thing that you would apply to an image, right? So if you have an image of a digit, someone might theorize that looking for a sort of arc is a good thing to look for to recognize a digit. So they'd write a little program that had a mathematical definition of some kind for arc, and then they would run that over the image and feed a neural net with, for example, 0 or 1 based on whether it had the arc or not, right? So human experts in a specific problem domain, that's like a hypothetical example. I have no idea if that corresponds to like a thing that anybody did, right? But human experts used to design these feature extractors, and then neural networks are trained on the output of the feature extractor. So the problem with this is that this is both labor-intensive and difficult, right? Designing a feature extractor requires a human expert in the problem domain, right? Like a human expert in sound processing, or image processing, or video processing, to sit down and think about what a good feature to represent that data is, and then take the time to develop a robust implementation of that feature extractor, right? And this is bad for a lot of reasons. It means that our neural network is sort of it's cheating, basically. It's getting a benefit from a priori knowledge, right? So there's human knowledge of the problem that the network is getting to exploit, basically, right? It's also expensive because your human subject matter expert's time is probably expensive. And it's expensive because it's labor intensive. It's probably going to take your human expert a while to build good features. Well, what if we could take the feature learning task and fold that into the learning agent, right? The idea already is, the idea already is that the neural network can learn complicated behaviors that we don't know how to design well. Well, maybe that's feature extraction. Feature extraction is a complicated behavior that takes human experts time to do, and that human experts don't always know how to do well. So maybe we could make learning those features a task the neural net does for us. Okay? So from this, convolutions. Convolutions are all over digital signal processing. They're a big part of how you look for features in a signal. So, if we are talking about having a network learn on its own what good input features are, we're essentially talking about having the network learn the filter or kernel for a convolution. Okay? Very loosely. Like my DSP professor would throw an eraser at my head loosely. When you perform a convolution, you slide one function, which is the feature or filter or kernel, over another, which is the signal, and look for where they're similar. The output of the convolution is going to be, so it's going to be a continuous function, right? That will have a high value, where the signal and the feature or filter or kernel are similar, and a low value where they aren't. Okay? Oh boy, I can't write. That's the word kernel, and that's the word filter. Okay? So notice that I didn't say 1 and 0. Convolutions are not normalized, okay? The scale of the output depends on the scale of the function, right? if you have a function that's 100 at some point and a filter that's 50 at some point, it'll output like 50,000, right? Or 5,000, right? So they're not normalized. That's why I said high and low, right? And interpreting the output of a convolution is actually a little bit trickier than that. It kind of depends on the signal and the filter, but we don't really need to worry about that right now. So there are a lot of good pictures for this. I stole this one from Wikipedia. Thankfully, Wikipedia is Creative Commons, so we can all thank Brian Amberg for sharing his artwork, Creative Commons. Here, right, this blue thing, like the blue rectangle, colors, right? The blue rectangle in this picture is the signal, right? And it is not moving. The red rectangle, crud. Which one of these is red? Nope. Red rectangle. The joys of doing it live. I think my on-screen drawing program just freaked out. That's what happened. All right, I'm not going to overthink this. So, sorry. The blue, close enough. The blue square is the filter we are convolving over. And the red moving square is the filter, right? Blue is the function or signal. Red is the filter. And that black line, right, is the value of the convolution. And we see, right, it's 0 for a while, and it starts becoming positive when they meet, and it peaks at 1 where they are identical, right? Because here the signal and the filter are identical, right? So when they perfectly overlap, you get a high value. And then it starts going down again after it slides off and they differ, right? So we interpret this, right? Or we can interpret this as finding sort of a match between our signal and our filter, right? They match right here. And then the second image, we have a filter, right? Same filter in red, a different signal in blue, and we see that they don't ever match, right? When they meet, the value starts to become positive, but it peaks, right? Because they don't completely agree. And then it slides back to 0, right? So that's a convolution. Convolutional neural networks, in the strictest, most mathematical sense, do not perform a convolution. They are convolution-like, right? So do be aware, basically, if you go to a job interview or a math class or something, that convolutional neural networks are not exactly equivalent to a convolution. They are different. So with all of that handled, actually, let's have a video break here.